standing in the famous gazebo in Niagara-on-the-Lake, featured in Stephen King's movie adaptation of the 1980s hit movie, The Dead Zone. Across the ditch, as they affectionately call the Niagara River, sits the famous Fort Niagara in Youngstown, New York. We can see its majestic, ominous castle across the way, as they once did in the 1800s. And from all the intricacies within the fort, its long and winding pathways which lead to their own riverbank, they once watched and fired upon the shores of Lake Ontario, where I stand.
Fort George was constructed in 1796 to essentially act as a counter to the American Fort Niagara, as well as to guard the Niagara River, which was one of the main transportation routes really on the continent. We move on in time, Fort George's importance really increased. It actually became the main headquarters in the Niagara area, or the Centre Division as it was known during the War of 1812. It was actually destroyed by the Americans by artillery fire from the opposite shore, burnt right to the ground, with one exception. Our powder magazine, oddly enough, or ironically enough, actually managed to survive that massive artillery bombardment. And was actually the scene. Once it was destroyed, 2 days later, the Americans attacked, actually along the shores of Lake Ontario. Huge army, 6,000 plus men, and the British had 1,350. Just from that math, you can likely gather what the outcome of that battle would be. And after a very short but nasty firefight, the Americans succeeded in routing the British. And that left the Niagara area, obviously Fort George included, now under the occupation of U.S. forces.
Each year, Fort George has ghost walks, usually starting in the summertime, hosted by an amazing group of tour guides from Friends of Fort George. Definitely worth checking out. They run from summer until, of course, Halloween.
Well, Fort Niagara was established by the French in 1726. It wasn't their first attempt to fortify the site. They'd made a couple of efforts in the late 17th century, and those were both failures. But in 1726, they came out here and they built what we call today the French Castle, which was a large stone building. They had gotten permission from the Onondaga Nation to erect a stone house here, but the natives did not want the French to erect a stone fort. So what they did was they designed a very large house that was fortified. So it was really a fort disguised as a chateau. And they held the fort for 33 years until 1759. In that year, it was the 5th year of the 7 Years' War. The British, along with New York provincial troops and native allies, laid siege to the fort in July. They conducted a 19-day siege, very much along European lines. And after holding out for almost 3 weeks, the French were compelled to surrender. So now the post becomes a British fort. And the British hold it until 1796. So they're holding this fort through the period of the American Revolution. And as such, they're using Fort Niagara. First of all, it's their headquarters on the Great Lakes, but they're arming and supplying raiding parties that are striking the frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania. The fort serves as a refuge for loyalists and Native Americans who have been displaced from their homes. And just in general, it's kind of a thorn in the side of the backcountry of New York and Pennsylvania. When the war ends, under the terms of the treaty that ends the American Revolution, the fort is supposed to come to the United States, but Britain holds on to it for an additional 13 years. Finally, in 1796, as a result of the Jay Treaty, the U.S. Takes possession of the fort and holds it until the War of 1812.
And not to be outdone, Old Fort Niagara offers ghost tours featuring ghosts from the fort's violent past. Visitors can also linger by a bonfire and hear the true stories of the unexplained supernatural sightings on the fort's grounds. And if that's not enough, the tours also offer post-graveyard tours dating back to 1755.